Well, a year after they started, student transfers are making headlines and heating up the conversation around education. Tonight, what do they mean for those specific schools and for all of us?
And on Stay Tuned, you drive the discussion. We bring local experts, journalists, and civic leaders together to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Tweet us your insights on tonight's topic, and you've got a seat at the table. With a few national experts and a panel of community members, this is the show bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. So stay tuned.
Well, we've beefed up the staff tonight. The 9 Network's Jim Kircher is joining us. Jim has reported extensively, to say the least, on education in the St. Louis region. Earlier this week, moderated a discussion on this very topic as part of American Graduate. Give us a little background.
Well, you know, American Graduate for the past few years, the 9 Network has been leading this initiative. It's really about, well, it's much more than getting more kids to graduate. It's finding ways, and community partners, like more than 50 community partners, working to find solutions to get kids graduating, keep them in school, keep them interested, keep them engaged, and then get ready for post-secondary school and careers and productive lives. So this is steady work.
A large body of work as well.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about the Normandy issue, the Riverview Gardens issue, is really the question is, there's 2 questions, and I think we're going to talk a lot about this tonight. What's happening in that one district? If people know where it is, it's just to the northwest edge of the city of St. Louis, has about 3,000 to 4,000 students, depending on whether you're counting the transfers or not. Okay, so you've got that issue, but the real question here, and I think this is the question for the entire region, is this an acceptable thing? Not for those kids in that neighborhood. Clearly it's not, to have a school district that's not performing. But what does it mean for the entire metropolitan area if we have not just school districts that aren't performing, but many, many kids who aren't being prepared for life and living in our community? And so that's, as we move forward in this, in American Graduate, and then we cover what's going on with the transfer laws and all of that. It's, what does that mean? Is that acceptable to this region to have those many kids not getting through prepared? And if not, what are we going to do about it?
The story took you to Columbia, Missouri this week.
Right. And so let's just go back to find out, to remind ourselves what happened with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, or the Board of Education rather, and the decision they made about the future of Normandy.
The motion is carried.
It was a long time coming, but it wasn't a big surprise. In a packed conference room in Columbia this week, the State Board of Education voted unanimously to shut down the unaccredited Normandy School District on June 30th and bring it back the next day under new management as the Normandy Schools Cooperative. The elected board is out. The new management will be an appointed board under state control. A clear decision that only raises a lot more questions.
But the answers don't all exist today. This meeting is adjourned.
The size and makeup of the new Normandy board will probably be determined next month. Current Normandy employees will lose their jobs, but most will probably be hired right back so school can resume in the fall. But it's not clear if Superintendent Ty McNichols will be asked to stay on. And the big question that no one could answer, what about the students who were allowed to transfer out of Normandy this year? The state legislature passed a new accreditation and transfer law, but the State Board of Education did not know if the governor was going to veto it.
You can't write any kind of effective guidelines on what might be.
After the meeting, Board President Peter Herschend and Education Commissioner Chris Nicastro met with a few reporters to talk about the decision to reinvent Normandy.
And we have a house that's educationally on fire in Normandy. And you cannot have a discussion about fire suppression equipment. You call the fire department and you create change, because you have to stop whatever is going on.
I think we all have to look at 14-15 as an opportunity for transition. We're not going to go from where we are on June 30 to where we want to be on July 1st. You can't snap your fingers and make all those changes and transitions. So we recognize that there's going to be a series of steps and actions that'll have to be taken through this coming year.
While kids returning to their schools this fall will probably not see much of a difference, the new board will be tackling the budget, staffing, instruction, school choice, and alternative school issues, and the possibility of longer school days and a longer school year. And Board President Hersham says this is not just about one school district.
The topic today is Normandy, but the fact is that we are modeling here and attempting to build a model for other districts who will go through exactly this same question down the line, whether it be tomorrow or 10 years from tomorrow.
So, potential bankruptcy, new laws, lawsuits. The kids can sometimes get lost in all of this conversation, as well as the community at large. So we'd like to start tonight's conversation right there with a man whose passion is how this affects the community, Starsky Wilson. Starsky, I wore a suit this evening because I knew you were going to be on the show, but your work is taking you on the road, so we appreciate you joining us on the phone. I'm sure you're well dressed, nevertheless. Let me ask you, just start off right there. We just heard from the decision makers. I'm curious, how much do the conversations you hear coming out of Columbia, Missouri, Jefferson City, sound like the conversations in your congregations? And let me back up and just say St. John United Church of Christ, the Deaconess Foundation, how much do those conversations sound alike?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm glad to be on in this important conversation. What I'll say first is that I think the conversation sounds absolutely different depending on who you're listening to. And the greatest challenge seems to be right now is that parties are not necessarily listening across all levels. While we talk about the number of students who have left Normandy, we also have to recognize that some 80% have stayed, have weighed in to say that this is where we'd like to be, have gone to Jefferson City in buses to say we rally around and want to have another chance with our superintendent, and those kinds of questions are up in the air. So I think the question of conversation is an important one, and the key is that our policies that we get will always be influenced by who we listen to. And so I think this is one of those situations where there are still some questions to be asked and answers to be given. And I think we would be well served to continue to seek out the voices of children who are affected, of parents who are engaged in the district, and those who are neighbors who have been involved in this daily life circumstance. So I think there's still room for that, and I pray that we do so.
So what is the reaction in your congregation, in the community at large that you serve, to the headlines we're seeing literally just this week?
In many cases, there are reactions of fear. There are some who recognize, there are many who recognize that we must do something different. There are great concerns, though, about what the implications of the governor's decision about 493 will be. There are those who are concerned about whether these districts will have an opportunity with resources to go forward. And people are looking very closely and people are very concerned, I'll say, at the fact that it seems that their voices are not being taken into consideration at the levels of those who are actually in the district and students and parents are in the district every day. So I think there's great consternation and concern about that, about the fact that there have been plans put forward and the response to them from neighbors and affected communities. And so I think that's the greater concern, and I think that has a longer-standing implication because how we handle this policy discussion will impact how we handle those in the future, particularly as it relates to our children.
You mentioned Senate Bill 493. We'll dive into that more later. Something else you're going to be diving into as well, a social component. Is there a need for a social component to this conversation, to these solutions, and why?
I think there's absolutely a need for a social component. I think I want to clarify really quickly. When you note that, when you say social component, I'm not immediately kind of go to the social services and supports that are required for students in these districts, the wraparound services and supports there. And of course, that's informed by the needs of those particular students. So I want to clarify that that's what you mean, because that's how I'm responding, to say absolutely yes. And then I'd go further to say, while many in the community are working to align supports, resources, services, and funding for children in need based upon the footprints of these districts, some of the decisions that are made and how these things will play out have great implications for that.
That was what I was referencing, and I think that's what our guest will be referencing later tonight as well. I guess last question, do you feel like that is something that our leaders are hearing as well?
I think our leaders who are engaged in the discussion hear it. I pray that they hear it strongly enough to really understand and appreciate that the community is moving and has a great desire to work together using collective strategies to align and support our youth. But the greatest system that we've ever developed for young people is our educational system. And so we need something to insulate. We need something that is stable and consistent to wrap these services around as we seek to support young people, no matter where they are and no matter what their life circumstances are. So stability and consistency as it relates to our school districts, particularly those for students who are of the greatest need, is of the greatest importance. None of these other efforts will have sustaining success unless we get the kind of stability in our districts that we need, and that only happens when we all talk at all levels, listening first to those who are most deeply affected, which are the children, which are the young people, which are the parents in these districts.
Sarsky Wilson, the Deaconess Foundation, thanks for your time tonight. Thanks for all the work that you're doing and for being a return guest on the show.
Thank you very much for having me and for convening this very important conversation.
Okay, and those of you at home, we want your voice on this conversation as well. You can't call in, we don't have the time, but we do want you on social media. Hashtag Stay Tuned STL and hashtag AmGrad STL. Let's see what you're already saying. Well, let's go a little deeper, a little behind the headlines, and how about we do it with the folks that write the stories and produce the stories that generate those headlines. Joining us tonight from St. Louis Public Radio, Dale Singer and Elisa Crouch from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Both of you have covered these issues extensively. Maybe we should start with a little bit of homework, if you will, not to make it sound too tedious, but we just heard Starsky mention 493. People are throwing that number around. Why? What is it? What does it mean? And how is it different than Jim's piece that we saw where the state dissolved Normandy and is going to reorganize it?
493 was the 135-page student transfer bill that was passed by the legislature last week. Actually, it's got a lot more in it than just student transfers. Just to give you an idea, the original student transfer law that passed in 1993 was 2 paragraphs. This bill is 135 pages, so it's very extensive. It's got everything from student transfers to expansion of charter schools to make sure you let the parents know when a school's become unaccredited, to parent portals and online tutoring within libraries, all sorts of things. It's got a little bit for everybody to like, and sometimes a little bit for everybody not to like.
How did it get from 2 paragraphs to 135 pages?
Well, that's what happens when things are addressed by the legislature. You know, it started as the legislature attempting to make some changes to the school transfer statute. Basically trying to, what happened in effect was the legislature came in and said, you know, we want to reduce the number of kids who are eligible to transfer. And we also want to reduce the financial burden on the unaccredited school districts, because as we've seen play out this school year, it's been incredibly expensive on Normandy and Riverview, and we're looking at Normandy potentially being insolvent in the next few weeks and Riverview being insolvent next year. So that was the attempt, and as things play out, you have lawmakers who want certain aspects in the bill and who won't vote for it unless it gets something else in there, and so then we end up with a pretty large piece of legislation.
Maybe we should tick through just a few things here. I think we can represent this visually to some degree. Senate Bill 439, here are the highlights. 493. Tuition limits. Can you kind of explain what that means? What are we talking about tuition here?
Depending on how much a receiving district charges, the sending district might have to pay only 90%, and the state would pick up the other 10%. It might only have to pay 70%, and if it's, depending on whether it's 90 or 70, there might be incentives involved. There might be, I think one of the incentives is that the test scores for some of the transfer students wouldn't be counted in the receiving district's test scores.
If they pick up more of the cost.
Right, for 3 years or 5 years.
And when we say tuition, individual schools, people may not realize this, charge different amounts for what it costs to educate a child.
For transfer students, and it can be anywhere from, I think Clayton's is the highest, around 20,000, and it goes down to, I think, around 7,000 or 8,000 per student.
Which is often a lot more than what the sending district receives from the state
Right.
per student.
Yes.
Right, and that's why Normandy is in the financial shape it's in.
No transportation requirement. Transportation was something that was a little undefined, and they said certain districts we will pay to send our students to certain districts, so that this 493 does what with transportation?
It makes it optional. So the sending districts can decide whether or not they want to send buses at all. So the existing
Which
bill,
means they will not, I would assume.
you would assume so. But they could decide to, potentially.
Because that's been a cost as well, and it's been
Right,
pretty
not as
burdensome.
much as tuition, but still a cost.
Right. And that makes transferring much more difficult for a lot of children, because not every parent can, not every parent has transportation in either of those two districts, and also not every parent has a work schedule that allows them to take their kids to and from school every day.
Especially if it's as far away as some of the districts that we're actually being transferred to. Private school option, what is this? And also just in the Kansas City, St. Louis area.
This is what has caused a lot of controversy, a lot of conversation, and has prompted Governor Nixon to be very unhappy. Private school option means that if it's approved by voters in one of the unaccredited districts, that students could transfer to a non-sectarian private school in that district, and the money that would pay the tuition would become only from their locally generated tax funds, not from the state. And this is something that people sometimes use a shorter hand and say this is vouchers. And other people say, no, it's not a voucher. A voucher bill would be much broader than this. It would be much more choice. So, but this is what has made people say that Governor Nixon may end up vetoing the bill altogether.
Is there a private non-sectarian school in the Normandy School District?
No. And so that's what's fascinating about this. This one single piece in this bill has been the most hotly contested part of it, but it doesn't really apply to the current situation. So kids in Normandy have no options besides transferring out to public schools. And from what I understand, there might be one small
there's one in
private
Riverview Gardens.
school in Riverview Gardens.
I believe it's called Storman Academy or something like that.
Yeah.
But
So why is this such a priority for a particular group?
that's a very good question, and I think the underlying principle here has always been we want to give students more options for quality education, and they're saying this should be another option. Now, these private schools wouldn't necessarily want to take students, because one of the things private schools pride themselves on is that there are no government strings attached, because they don't take any government money. If they accept transfer students, they have to be accredited by whatever group accredits private schools in their sphere. They have to make sure that the students take MAP tests and other things. And if their enrollment rises, I believe it's 25%, then they have even more strictures put on them. So I've talked to headmasters at private schools and asked them about this question not on this bill, but just a question in general about getting public money, and a lot of them will reflexively say, no, we don't want public scrutiny, we don't want public restrictions, so we don't want public money.
Okay, the next thing on our graphic, it says lapsing districts, and giving the state the ability to intervene. What is that talking about in terms of 493?
That's basically what
We've seen this week.
What the state did to Normandy this week, although they didn't do it under 493 because that's not law. They did it under another bill that was passed last year called 125, which basically gave the state board and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education greater latitude, more choices to what they could do for districts that are chronically underperforming.
And the charter schools is not too dissimilar from the private school option in terms of the spirit of more options is the goal.
Well, the charter school provision in the Senate bill that is now before the governor, it basically makes it easier to open up a charter school in Riverview or Normandy. So by allowing, I think it shortens the amount of time. I mean, it just allows them to expedite. I think more groups could open a charter school under this legislation.
We have to talk about it because we've teased it by seeing it here, but because then I want to get to a piece that you wrote recently, Elisa. But the school improvement fund, what would this be, and where does this money come from? What would it be used for?
The school improvement fund in general, it will be used to help raise student achievement whenever districts are not performing up to par, and it's just one of many funds that were created by the bill. Where the money's going to come from, I guess it'll have to be appropriated from the general fund. I just do want to make one point on the charter schools to reemphasize that charter schools are public schools. They're not part of school districts, but they're public schools already. They're being paid for by the public, so it's a little different than the non-sectarian private school.
Let's tackle that in a little bit later in the show because I want to talk about the intersection of poverty and performance in schools. You did a long piece, a very thorough, in-depth piece in the paper recently. Where do these intersect, and is that part of the conversation in an adequate way, do you think?
Well, so the piece took a look at not only the concentrations of poverty and the Normandy and Riverview Gardens school districts, but also we took a look at how students were performing in school districts across the region, even in high-performing districts. And what we found is there's, we weren't really, in some ways we weren't telling people anything that was new. We were showing that low-income students have a tremendous disadvantage when it comes to school performance. And so in Normandy and Riverview Gardens, you have, those two districts are comprised primarily of students who are of very little means.
And this impacts their education how? What does the data show?
So, with poverty, the thing that we don't see, the one thing that the data does not show is how much. We can't show causation, so we don't know what exactly causes low school performance. We don't know. I mean, we do know that with poverty, oftentimes comes high mobility. Kids move around a lot. That affects their performance. We know that. We look at occupancy rates in Riverview Gardens. We see there's a high number of rentals. Kids coming from impoverished homes a lot of times have stresses in their lives that make it difficult to do their homework at night. So what the data also shows is that even in school districts like Ladue, even in high-performing districts like Kirkwood and Parkway, we see that kids coming from low-income backgrounds aren't doing nearly as well as their more affluent peers.
Thank you both, but don't go anywhere because we have more to talk about. But for right now, we want to transition for just a second. We have another conversation to have.
So we hear that, so many things working against a school district like Normandy. The question has to be, is there really anything that can be done to to fix this because of all of the things that need to be fixed. So we have joining us Carol Basile from the University of Missouri St. Louis Education Department, but also the chairman of the Normandy Task Force. You guys on the task force made the recommendations to the state school board about some of the steps that can be taken. Also, Philip Boyd, assistant superintendent at Normandy, outgoing. You've got another job, although on June 30th, I guess you would have been, your contract would have been up and then you would have been waiting. But you are leaving the district, but you've been there for a while. So I want to ask you both, get into this question of really, is this too big of a job? But I'm going to go back to, and I was just thinking about it 5 minutes ago, Normandy Schools Collaborative, right? I know the task force wanted to keep the district within its boundaries, didn't want to break it up. And then I thought, well, there's some meaning to that name, Normandy Schools Collaborative, the new name. Carol, why, what's the meaning of that name, or what's the meaning behind that name?
I think what's interesting about Normandy in itself is that it is sitting in this very unique context, right next to the University of Missouri St. Louis, and then also within this community of 24 different municipalities. I mean, it's amazing for people to think about 6 schools in a 3 square mile area of 24 different municipalities, and yet the community there is very strong. It's come together. You know, thank you to Beyond Housing and 24/1, the work they do in trying to bring those communities together. This is a unique opportunity to take a small school district and really do something very different with it, and really think about those parallel structures, how a university can be part of this, and how do we really do something that's very different today.
And Philip Boyd, we saw the signs at the Board of Education meeting, Normandy Strong. So there's strength within that community, within that district. Your job was to work with some of those partners and those resources. Why wasn't it working? Why hasn't it been working? Or was it beginning to work and all of a sudden now we have to start over again?
Well, to allude to something that Carol was mentioning, you know, this really is about looking at how we use a collective impact model to change things. And when I came into the district, from the district perspective, that was really the first time the district started looking at how do we really partner with 24/1 and with other agencies in ways that were very intentional, making sure that our partnerships are really plugged into the mission and to the needs of both children and parents in the district. I think that there are a couple of things that impacted Normandy's performance over time. I think that there were obviously issues around having the right leadership in place to make sure that those, you know, the strong instructional leadership was happening, but I also think that you had issues around poverty. We have a fairly high mobility rate, and at the same time, Lisa kind of spoke to this, when you look at not just the region, but the nation, those areas across the United States where you have the highest amounts of poverty are also where you have the lowest performance on state standardized tests.
Has anybody successfully bucked that? Are there solutions that are actually working?
There are solutions, but I think what has happened is that we have to get beyond some of the rhetoric of what we want to be quick fixes. We have to say, wait a minute, if we're looking at trying to stabilize families, right? Because initially, families are basically the first schoolhouse for kids. So when you have issues around kindergarten readiness, that's about what's going on in the community, what's going on in the household. So how is it that we can strengthen communities so that they can be partners with the school, not just, you know, standing off to the side, but actually being very intentional partners around the educational process for their kids. The other thing you have to make sure is that you're looking at issues around economic development, workforce development, and being very intentional about creating this wraparound for the entire school district and for that school community. That's where we need to go with this.
Let's talk short term. Carol, there were a lot of things that the state board didn't vote on, that the task force has made recommendations. So let's talk about some of the fixes that can begin to be put in place so that kids begin to perform better, learn more, however you want to say it, right? That this school and these kids begin to do better. What can be done, or what are some of the steps that can begin to be taken?
I think the main thing that we have in the plan that I think is really important is this parallel structure. I think one of the reasons why some of this doesn't work or doesn't work as well as we'd like it to work, and we know that these could be very high leverage practices, as Philip is talking about, is that we haven't formalized those structures. And we need to start by formalizing those structures. So in the plan, we talk not only about governance, but we also talk about the internal structures to bring the community in, to begin to think about what is these innovation communities, we call them, but these pillars to try to identify what are the what are the 5 things, the 3 to 5 things we think really could turn this around? And we make sure that not only are we doing these in the school, so we're communicating to kids, but we're also communicating the same things to the community. So the school district has talked a lot about learning by doing and thinking about changing that instructional model. Well, how do we send those messages also to the community? If we want kids to understand about caring and respect, how do we send those same messages that the community also has to be thinking about care and respect? So the kids are not only hearing about it in school, they're also getting that at home.
I know
that's been a big part of what we do.
UMSL is a neighbor of this school district. Express Scripts is a neighbor of this district. I've seen Express Scripts mentioned as a possible partner. How do you bring in, and again, I know there's a lot of this already going on under 24-1 and some of the other things, but how do you get those institutions or business in a way that they can begin to make a difference?
Well, I think part of it is, and I think that we have a great situation here with someone like Ty McNichols. I think he came in with a larger vision for what can happen with the schools, and then making sure that the leadership of the district is able to, again, connect in a very real and intentional way those resources with the needs of the children and the families, but not just needs, but also opportunities. Making sure that if we're looking at partnering with the UMSL, and Dean Basile was very instrumental in creating this model that we're calling UMSL and NHS, about making sure that you have access to advanced credit placement classes and making sure that kids have early exposure to those experiences on a collegiate campus and collegiate professors. The other thing is to also make sure that you have access to not only Express Scripts, but also with Emerson and Boeing, making sure that children and teachers have access to kind of real-world applications of what they're learning, real-world applications of science, of math, and within those institutions, you're also talking about real-world applications of communications and really understanding how do we create, these kind of wonderful pieces of technology that really are affecting our world, so that our children aren't just consumers, but they're creators of technology.
Longer school days, longer school year. You see that happening in Normandy?
Oh yeah.
Year-round school.
That's what they're proposing.
Yeah.
For next year. I think it's a good thing.
The other thing is the board president Hirschen said this is not about Normandy. This is a model for what's coming. Mm-hmm. Is this a model for the 2015 when the new accreditation scores come in, possibly for the city of St. Louis, possibly for Kansas City? Or are we talking smaller districts than that?
No, I think I think that ultimately that's what we hoped. I mean, we hope that whatever the decisions we make and whatever process we put in here, I mean, this is setting a precedent for what others can do, and we think that even if a large school district looks at this and says, look, if you can do this in a small school district, then can we scale it up? And are there some models here that we can take away and be able to use in these larger school districts? I think anything's possible.
Briefly, collective impact. It's something we've heard a lot about with American Graduate. And in making what's going on here, addressing this issue, not Normandy and Riverview and this place and that place, but addressing this as a region, as a metropolitan area together. Where's that going? Are we going to see other cities have done this? Cincinnati has something called Strive, where they're addressing this as a metropolitan area. Do you see that ready to happen in St. Louis?
I think we are going to see that. Right now, you have an initiative called Ready by 21. And it's a similar initiative to the collective impact models that we're seeing in Cincinnati, that we've seen in Boston, that we're seeing in Atlanta. And it's a realization by both for-profit and nonprofit social service agencies and local governments that we have to work together. When you talk about really changing things in communities, you have to make sure those supports are there. Again, you have to look at economic development, workforce development, and also making sure that you have meaningful learning experiences for children.
And I think we're going to be hearing more about that. Again, American Graduate's going to be part of that as well. But I think there's probably going to be some announcements made, I would think, within the next year or so. Carol, you're going to be involved in that. You're going to continue to be involved, whether you like it or not, as part of the Normandy Task Force. And Philip Boyd, thank you for joining us from the Normandy District for that inside look as well. We always hear, if you want to find out what's going on in schools and what the issues are with kids, you should talk to kids. That's what Anne Marie Berger did recently with a group of young people.
So we've heard a lot that young people need consistent, caring adults in their lives. How important is that to you all when you know that your teacher cares? How does that affect you? How does that inspire you?
That's one of the biggest effects you can have when you have someone that actually cares about you, and it's like one of the motivations of a lifetime.
I believe that adults play a big role. They're just the ones that their affirmation really counts the most.
What do students need from their teacher?
They should be nice, but at the same time strict, and they should be able to push you to do higher things.
I don't want you to make a bad grade seem better than it is. A C is not that bad. I want you to tell me what I did wrong and how can I get it better.
What is quality education? What does it mean to you?
I believe quality education is education that prep you for the real world, prep you to get a job.
I also believe that quality education should also teach you to stand out in a way, because you're going into a world of so many individuals with already a lot of skills equipped from high school and other sorts.
One thing I'd say is level the playing field by equalizing resources among schools. I brought the whole Riverview Garden because I'll say it again, because I am truly blessed to go to the school I am, because I'm in the DSEC program, and so that means I'm from the inner city of St. Louis, but I get bused out to Clayton every morning. And the schools around my neighborhood are just struggling to get by. Recently, they just exported kids out of Normandy.
If we're talking about wanting our community to get involved, if the community in Normandy needs to rise around that school, if people in Riverview Garden needs to rise around that school, if you were a student there, what would you want to see?
I was a student at Riverview Garden. So, I would want to see the community actually rise and get us better education, get us teachers that's actually going to be there and say, we need to do this, get this done.
Well, are you happy that you transferred?
Yes, I am happy I transferred, and I do have more academic chances, but I would rather have to go 10 minutes from my house to go to Riverview Gardens and get a good education there, and they have to take 2 hours to go all the way down to Maplewood and get my education there.
Close us out.
You have to start off really young with the child and let them know the importance of education. Show them the value that it has, and show that education can open up doors for them in the long run. Stick with them, read a book with the child, starting from a very young age, and establishing in their mind that education is valuable.
Okay, picking back up on that conversation about what our legislatures are doing about this issue, and also how charter schools might be playing a role in that. We still have Dale Singer from St. Louis Public Radio and Elisa Crouch from the Post at the table, but we've brought in a couple of gentlemen who can kind of give us an inside look on these conversations. Representative Rick Stream, Republican from Kirkwood, working for us at the state level, and then Doug Thaman, Missouri Charter Public School Association. Representative Stream, I'll start with you, just kind of based on something Dale said earlier, that the Senate Bill 493, which both bodies have signed off on and is now before the governor to decide, reduces transfer students, doesn't eliminate transfer students. So we want to keep the transfer law in place. Is that a fair statement?
I think it would be important for everybody to understand what we tried to do with this bill, which was to get students who are in failing buildings, in failing school districts, into successful buildings, whether that was in their own district or in a nearby public school system, or into a charter school in their district or a private non-sectarian school in their district. That was the prime point of this entire bill, was to get students immediately out of a failing educational environment and move them into a successful environment.
Are we making too much of going from 2 paragraphs to 135 pages? Is that just the way the business is done these days, or is this trying to be all things to all people?
Well, we tried to restrict what was in the bill to just education items that dealt directly with the transfer law that was in place already and how we would address that. But there were a lot of considerations. We worked very hard in the House to get buy-in from everybody, every constituency. The Black Caucus met in my office 3 times on this bill. We met with the Democrats as well as the rural Republicans, who are generally opposed to any type of education reform. So we met quite a bit with the groups in the House, and we also met with the senators who were important, who were working on this bill over on the other side.
Doug, what role would you like to see charter schools play?
Well, I think that it's important to remind everyone that charter schools are public schools. They are tuition free. They are held accountable to the same performance standards as any other public school in the state of Missouri, and they have to be in compliance with state and federal regulations. So charter schools are an option for families. And that's the role that I think charter schools can really play in Normandy and in other unaccredited districts as time goes on, is the ability to put another public school option in the community where families are living that provides them a high-quality education.
So what can they do that the public school, the traditional public school as we know it, can't do? Why would a charter school work?
Charter schools have a little bit more autonomy. They have their own governing board that is responsible for the operation of that school and the oversight, a little more flexibility in the way that they are able to structure the spending of their budget focused on one school and the students in that school. Charter schools traditionally have a longer school day, a longer school year. They have more innovative practices they can put in place. And they also have smaller class sizes. And charter schools have the ability to make changes a little more quickly because they're not making changes that apply to an entire district. They're making changes to that immediate school and student population.
Are they more selective in the students they accept?
They are not selective. Charter schools are public schools, and so there are no enrollment criteria. They are tuition free. They're open to any child that lives within that attendance area.
And how big of a part of the conversation was this in Jeff City?
It was a major part. I mean, again, our goal was to get the kids out of an education situation that was not very good for them and get them into a high quality education environment. Charter schools are part of that. We wanted to give parents and students options to get out of this failing environment into a successful one. Charter schools have proven to be successful in many areas. Some have not, but Senate Bill 125 a couple of years ago addressed the failing charters. So charter schools play a big part in giving parents and students options.
Can you make the argument that, not to put you on the spot, that the two of you are in touch with what's going on in Normandy, or that the state lawmakers are, as a body, are in touch? We heard our first guest tonight say fear is his sense of the community.
Well, we've talked to a lot of people in Normandy and Riverview Gardens, and their representatives in the legislature come from those areas. So we talked with them a lot about this particular bill. Many of us in the legislature come from an education background. I was on the Kirkwood School Board for 12 years, so we understand education issues. I think in this particular case with Normandy, for instance, they've been provisionally accredited in that district for 20 years. This did not happen overnight, and we felt with the Supreme Court ruling last year that we needed to act this year. So we put together a bill that is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly went through a process that lasted almost a year in the House. We toured the state last year in the fall, all over the state, to ask educators what they felt about unaccreditation and provisionally accreditation throughout the state, and with an eye toward trying to fix this situation in Normandy and Riverview.
What I can say I'm in touch with is the right that a parent has, and what I think is fear from a lot of parents in Normandy and other parts of the state when they don't feel they have choices available to them when it comes to their most precious item, their most precious thing, which is their child. And ideally what we'd like to see is high-performing charter schools, a high-performing district, all of the options being high-performing, so a parent really isn't making a choice of trying to escape something, but they're really looking at all those options and saying, that's the one that best fits my child's needs, that's where they're going to go to school.
But the representatives who represent Normandy, Representative Smith and Representative Pearson, who represents Riverview Gardens, they don't like the bill. Is there any, were you surprised by that? And why are the two of the representatives who are closest to the situation not too happy with what the final product was?
Well, I think that there are special situations with both of them. I have a good relationship with both of them. The senators, by the way, that represent that district all supported it and voted in favor of the bill. The Senate passed the bill 28-3 the week prior to adjournment. So I think that there was a lot of pressure on some of the representatives from the teacher unions to oppose the bill. And the private option is always an issue that gets people excited. And I think that was one of the issues that really caused a lot of opposition to the bill in our caucus as well as the Democratic caucus.
Well, now there's a lot of speculation that Governor Nixon will veto the bill because of the private option. How important was that private option to getting the bill passed? And why is it in there?
The Senate voted the bill out first with the private option when it came over the first time, 2 months before the end of session. I think the vote was 27-5. That was a pretty strong indication that they were not going to pass the bill without a private option. Again, it's one of the options that parents have, as well as charter schools and the transfer option. So in the House, which the private option is a harder sell, we had to really work hard with the rural Republicans first to get them to buy into it. And we watered it down quite a bit from the original Senate bill that came over. We put a lot of restrictions and guidelines on the private options so that it wouldn't be just open to any school district anywhere. We've restricted it strictly to unaccredited school districts or the failing school districts so that it can't be expanded beyond that point. I think that if the governor vetoes the bill, we go back to the 1993 law in which the limits are off. It's Katie bar the door for these receiving school districts. I would encourage the governor not to veto the bill. And if he doesn't want to sign it, just let it become law, and then we'll move forward. Because if he does veto it and calls us back into special session, my guess is we're going to send him the same bill.
If he vetoes it, is it possible to pass something in a special session without the main provision that he's objecting to, which is the private option?
I don't think so, because the Senate has clearly indicated in both their votes by overwhelming margins, 27-5 and 28-3, that they want the private option in there.
We're hearing on Twitter that the tuition aspect of this bill doesn't do enough, isn't going to fix it. Your thoughts on that?
I would agree personally. My original bill in the House lowered the tuition to 70% of the sending district's tuition. So for Normandy, which is $12,000, it would have lowered it to $8,400. But the Senate had a much larger number, a higher number, and we compromised on a number somewhat in between, probably closer to the Senate version. Personally, I don't think it goes far enough to help the sending districts.
Let's take a quick break because we want to bring back some of the guests we've had earlier tonight and kind of broaden the conversation. We'll be right back. I want to maybe re-ask that question to the table. Very practically, let's talk tuition and transportation. Is the transportation, let's start with the tuition. Is the fix, air quotes, in 493 enough on the tuition issue?
I think that's going to depend upon the leeway that the sending district will have in setting a tuition that won't be challenged. Right now, we've done several calculations going from 90% to 70% to 50% based upon what happened this past year. It's going to be difficult, even at 50% tuition, for us to be able to really function coming into July. You know, we're still looking at a severe deficit of operational revenue come July 1. So I think the fix is going in the right way, but I think it would have worked better if we had not already gone into a situation where we've drained all of our reserves.
And also transportation. Your thoughts on transportation? You wanted to kind of jump in. Dale was nipping at the question there.
I was just going to ask about the fact that transportation was now made voluntary and what the reasoning was in the legislature with that. What was the debate?
Well, it was primarily in the Senate bill. The House bills all had transportation included. I think the Senate felt that it would save money to the sending district, that they didn't have to pay transportation costs, which are pretty significant when you're sending kids out to, in Normandy's case, out to Francis Howell, and in Riverview's case, to Melville and Kirkwood. So I think that was the point of the Senate version. I feared that it was going to cause a lot of students who are going to those schools right now, who are transferring now, to cause them not to be able to find a way out to those schools.
Well, I want to ask you if the conversation includes, and maybe we can see our map that we had earlier, if that's possible. I want to know how much of the conversation is about the region as a whole, at the state level, and all of the different spheres you all are working in, because this could easily affect the larger school district of St. Louis Public Schools soon. Sure. And what does this mean? What does Normandy not being accredited mean to our region's economy? What does all of this mean for all of us?
Well, let me say something about the transportation piece. I mean, if you look at what's happened with what most of the districts have done with the tuition money they've received from Normandy, it's nothing. So to act as if there's no monetary answer for transportation, I think that's false. Right now, you have several districts that could be taking money out of the tuition money that they've received and use that for transportation. Again, we have maybe 3 districts that have used money from the tuition payments to actually hire more staff. The rest, that money is going into their general revenue. It's not being used to hire additional teachers, additional resource reading specialists, math specialists, or anything like that. So
folks from the Department of Education have publicly said they consider it a windfall for the receiving districts.
That's true. That's very true.
Okay, so the larger question, is that part of the conversation? What's at stake for everyone here?
Well, I think if we look at what happens with Normandy, Normandy sort of acts as a canary in the coal mine from the standpoint of if you have a region where you are neglecting communities and you're not trying to make sure that, again, that you're using collective impact models to make sure that you are stabilizing families, addressing issues around mobility, addressing issues around poverty, workforce development. If you look at parents in Normandy, many of the parents of our enrolled students, they're not unemployed, they're underemployed. So we've got to figure out ways to get them into true workforce investment programs that are going to make sure that their jobs are going to be good middle class jobs. That's going to be a huge issue in terms of really turning around community.
Okay, can you guys explain? I know there's one thing when we talk about fixing schools, we think about the right teachers, the right principals, the right superintendents, the right instructional plan. I keep hearing about wraparound services, right? Community schools, things that go beyond the classroom. What are we talking about when we talk about wraparound services and how important that is? What exactly is that?
Well, wraparound services, it's taking some of those social services that families need and embedding them into the school and rebuilding that idea of the school as a community center. And so we have charter schools that have a health clinic at the school or have a staff of social workers available to the families. And it's creating that community center that while my child's in school, if I need health services, if my child needs health services, it's all happening in the same place. It's all the same people who are really devoted to my child.
Sometimes when I ask the same question 3 times, it's not a good question. So let me ask it a slightly different way. Not talking about any of the progress or however else you might characterize the St. Louis Public Schools, there are some legal issues still playing out that may open up St. Louis Public Schools to transfer if they are not accredited. They're not unaccredited either right now. So I'm just curious, what could the larger implications be on a very practical level if that were to happen to a larger district? And what are the implications to the region as we stand right now?
Well, at the first trial or the most recent trial, on the transfer law, there was a study that, and at that time St. Louis was still unaccredited. The study said there would be thousands of students who would leave, and I believe one of the estimates was more students would transfer to Clayton than Clayton had resident students. So not only would the St. Louis Public Schools, I believe by the estimates, they would cost them hundreds of millions of dollars, but some of the receiving districts, it would cost them a lot of money to put new facilities in place. So,
is that a concern when you're talking about this? Or
sure. I mean, it's those of us who've been around this area for as many years as we have know that St. Louis Public School System has been sending students out to the county for 32 years under the VTS program, the VIC program now, the DSEC program. So St. Louis County school districts have been receiving students from St. Louis Public for a long time, and right now the tuition rate is $7,200 across the board. So, and that, according to the superintendents that I've talked to, is more than enough to educate those kids. So back to your point, that's why we tried to lower the tuition rate in the House bill and get it into the overall bill. But as far as St. Louis Public going unaccredited, again, they were unaccredited in 2006, and then they became provisionally accredited. The SAB was put in place back in 2007, so they've been under the provisions of the 1993 law per se since that time, and I think they're making progress. Under this bill that we just passed, though, if the governor lets it become law, the number of students that would transfer out would greatly lessen from the 15,000 that was quoted in that study.
Just a few seconds left. When might we see some change with this current situation we're looking at? Is there a timeline of any kind that we're looking at here? I'll open up to the reporters as well. Do you expect any change by the time school starts?
Well, it's going to depend greatly on what the governor does with 493. I mean, if he signs it, there's going to be a lot of change. If he doesn't sign it, then you've got to see what the state does with this new Normandy Schools Collaborative. At this point, they haven't determined whether or not it's unaccredited or accredited, and that's supposed to happen next month. If it's accredited, then Normandy students living there won't be allowed to transfer all those. The rules may be that they can stay in the schools where they are now, but no new ones could transfer. A lot of the uncertainty is still there, not only about 493, but about what's going to happen in Normandy.
And 2015, when the new accreditation numbers kick in, after 3 years of the accreditation numbers, that's when the city can lose accreditation. That's when other places could become provisionally accredited. I think that's when this is really going to hit this region and this state.
All right. I think definitely. I mean, I think there's definitely psychological damage here, both from the teacher standpoint and student standpoint, because people are just like, what's going to happen? Will I have the same teachers? Teachers are saying, will I have a job? And overall, that you also have this kind of spectrum of always having people question your quality as a teacher, your quality as a student, and there's all that noise out there that says, you're not as good as everybody else. And that's one of the most, I think, damaging and hurtful things about this whole process. And that's why I think it's important if we're going to really move forward and say, okay, fine, let's move forward, let's really transform the school district, let's really have powerful learning practices there, let's turn this into a model. I think even before the Transition Task Force recommendations, even with our Reformation Plan, the idea was we want to create a model for urban education that's really about looking at the whole child, looking at developmental needs of children, but also looking at how do we turn them into powerful learners. That has to be part of the conversation. If we just talk about how we're going to be able to fire teachers and fire administrators, when research keeps on telling us, look, for kids to really learn, we should look at, can kids really self-assess? Can they think about how they're learning? Can they adapt these metacognitive skills? Yet in this whole conversation, it's like we are not talking about what's going on with the learning of children. What should be the things that we believe in about what children need to learn and how they should learn?
Do we know if the transfer students are doing any better in Melville or Francis Howell?
We have anecdotes. We hear that parents like their schools, but until the test scores come out, and I'm hopeful that DESE or someone will take a look at growth and whether or not students have grown in their new schools, because until then we won't know.
Back to your article, though, there's still let me rephrase that. There's the potential that some of the students are dealing with some of the same issues they were at home, even though they transferred, and you broke it down earlier that doesn't know school district boundaries.
Sure. Well, just because you change schools doesn't mean that your home life is any better. It doesn't mean that you have a more supportive, adult network where you're coming from. It doesn't mean that you're having breakfast in the morning necessarily, but you could be in a classroom where you might have higher expectations. So, we'll just have to see. The jury's still out. We'll just have to see how the kids do.
Sorry,
Phil, let me ask you this, or Carol too. At this point in the school year, if Normandy has to lapse all its contracts and hire are there good teachers out there who don't have a job at this time of the school year?
Or have they already left and found other jobs?
No. I think it's going to be difficult. I mean, I think that's these are all the million-dollar questions here of how do you go out and how do we separate the wheat from the chaff? And we don't want to assume that every teacher in Normandy is an ineffective teacher. Right. And I think you have to be very, very careful, particularly at this time of year. I don't know what that percentage is. Only people in the district who've been out there and really paying attention to this really understand that. And I think we hear conversation about will and skill, right? And who's got the will and who's got the skill, and who can we get up to speed quickly, and what can we do over the summer, and all those kinds of things. And are there people? Do we go to TFA and say, oh, how many core members can you bring, and is that a good thing? Because putting in a lot of first-year teachers who really have no experience at all, you got to be pretty strategic about that. You can't just fill a school district with people who are really just getting into this game.
And then there are the resources you have to have in place.
That's right. And and at the end of the day, you're trying to do this and you're trying to develop a pipeline. I think what the reset does, though, is at least it allows you to be able to say, look, we've got some folks that really need to go, and you're able at least to make changes for whatever percentage that is, and go without a lot of the stuff that comes with trying to not have people who are really truly ineffective teachers in these schools.
How important is it to bypass the local politics of the local school board to get stuff done in the way you want to get it done?
It depends on the issue. But if we're talking about teachers, I think that the present board is about having excellent teachers.
The present board, the elected board,
right? The present elected
today.
board,
yeah.
and what I would hope would happen with any kind of change in the next iteration of what that board looks like is that they really look at the assessments that have been done on teachers. I mean, we have some really wonderful teachers in the district, and they need to stay because they're connected to students and they're connected to the community. There are other teachers that I don't know if this is the best place for them because Normandy is a district of heavy lifting. There are some extra things that you're going to need to do, and there are teachers that do that, and there are some teachers who feel challenged by that. So I think the flexibility that's going to come with the ability to say, let's really look at what's going on with the performance of teachers, I think that's going to be important. However, I really worry about this kind of broad brush that's been painted that there's nothing going right in Normandy. That's just not true. I mean, we had, some of our students that came back from school districts because they said, I need to feel connected, and what I experienced in this district or that district was no different than the teachers that I was, in front of in Normandy. So I think we have to be very careful about that.
I think it's all about leadership. Leadership from the top down in a district or a business or anything like that. And the leadership has to take responsibility for removing teachers that aren't doing the job. Dr. McNichols told me in Jefferson City that he would have liked to have let a number of teachers go, but he was not able to do so because he wanted to keep Teach for America teachers in place. He had to let the Teach for America teachers go instead of the teachers who weren't performing because of the existing contract situation.
Bottom of the totem pole.
Yeah, that's right. Last in, first out. So what's happened now is better in that respect. One other thing, there were a lot of parts of this bill that we haven't touched upon. One of them was, I think, a very important part, talking to the whole issue of where this is going to go region-wide and statewide, is that we've put in place a provision that will send assistance teams into provisionally accredited districts and accredited districts that are borderline. And the recommendations of those assistance teams have to be carried out in those districts for them to continue. So what we're trying to do is prevent other districts from becoming unaccredited in the state by turning them around while they're sliding downhill, getting them turned around and back up. But again, I think it boils down to leadership. We have good school buildings in Normandy and in Riverview Gardens. Why are those buildings operating well and the other ones not? It's all about leadership, and I've told Dr. Nicastro time and time again, why can't you replicate what's happening in those successful buildings in those districts throughout the rest of the school district? And that's the education establishment. That's not the legislature. That's the education establishment. People who are in the Missouri School Board Association, the School Administrators Association, the teachers unions, the State School Board, Department of Education. Those are the people, the professionals who are in this job who should be doing a better job in these districts. And it really falls on their shoulders to turn this around.